are you crazy? It's frivolous.
Right, right.
And I started to argue, and then I argued for about 20 minutes till I was...
There is a version of Blazing Saddles that never got made. A safer version, a quieter version. One where the slurs were softened, the satire was blunted, and the whole thing was packaged as a harmless Western spoof that wouldn't make anyone in a boardroom sweat. Warner Bros. Wanted that version. They pushed for it, lobbied for it, and at one point reportedly tried to pay for it to disappear entirely. What they got instead was one of the most subversive, uncomfortable, and enduring comedies in American film history. But the story of how it survived, that part has never been told the way it deserves to be. Most people know Blazing Saddles as a triumph, a landmark, a film that got away with things no studio would touch today. What they don't know is just how many times it almost didn't get away with anything at all. The battles weren't fought on screen. They were fought in screening rooms, in memos, in hallways at Warner Bros., and in the kind of quiet standoffs that never make it into DVD bonus features. The real story of Blazing Saddles isn't the one in front of the camera. It's the one that happened while executives tried to stop the camera from rolling. To understand how close this film came to being gutted, you have to understand how Mel Brooks got the green light in the first place, because he didn't get it by telling Warner Bros. What the film actually was. The project had a long and complicated road before it ever became Blazing Saddles. It started as a spec script called Tex X, written by Andrew Bergman, a film scholar who had a sharp eye for the Western genre and what it represented in American mythology. Bergman's original concept was smart and pointed, a black sheriff in a racist frontier town, but it was rough, unpolished, and lacked the comedic machinery that would eventually make it explosive. The script changed hands, went through rewrites, and eventually landed at Warner Bros. Under a different title, Black Bart. By the time Mel Brooks was brought in to direct, the studio had a general sense of what they were dealing with. What they didn't fully grasp was how far Brooks intended to take it. Brooks assembled a writer's room that was, by any measure, unlike anything Hollywood had seen. Richard Pryor was in that room. Andrew Bergman was there. Norman Steinberg and Alan Ugger contributed. And Brooks himself drove the process with a particular philosophy. Nothing was off limits, and anything that felt uncomfortable was probably the most important thing to keep. The writers didn't just punch up jokes, they sharpened the film's argument, which was essentially this: the American West, as mythologized by Hollywood, was a lie built on racism, and the only honest way to expose that lie was to make people laugh at it until they couldn't look away. That's not the pitch Warner Bros. Heard. What they heard, or at least what they allowed themselves to believe, was that they were getting a Western parody. Something in the neighborhood of a Mel Brooks comedy. Irreverent, fast, commercially viable. The studio had seen what Brooks did with the producers and understood that he had a gift for making provocative material palatable. What they miscalculated was the degree to which Blazing Saddles wasn't just provocative, it was confrontational, deliberately, structurally, and unapologetically so. The first real alarm went off over the script's language, specifically over the use of racial slurs which appeared not as background noise, but as a central device in the film's satire. The logic Brooks and his writers operated on was straightforward. You could not honestly portray racist townsfolk without letting them speak like racist townsfolk. Softening their language would be a form of dishonesty that would undermine the entire satirical project. Richard Pryor, who co-wrote the script, and whose voice was arguably the sharpest instrument in the room, was particularly firm on this point. Removing the language, in his view, would turn a film about racism into a film that was merely adjacent to racism, comfortable enough to ignore. Warner Bros. Executives did not see it that way. The studio began pushing back almost as soon as they read the draft, flagging the language as a liability. Their concern wasn't artistic, it was financial and reputational. This was 1973, not 2023, and the industry's calculus around race-related content was shaped almost entirely by fear. Fear of protest, fear of controversy. A film that might alienate white audiences who made up the majority of the ticket-buying market. The executives wanted cuts, they wanted substitutions, they wanted the edges filed down into something they could sell without a press crisis. Brooks refused, and this is where the story gets interesting, because his refusal wasn't the explosive table-flipping kind. It was methodical. He understood that open confrontation with the studio would lose him the film entirely. So instead of fighting every battle loudly, he picked the ones that mattered most and held those lines with absolute firmness, while giving ground on minor issues to preserve the major ones. It was a kind of strategic stubbornness. He let the studio feel like they were winning somewhere, while protecting the core of what the film was trying to do.
The N-word survived, so did the campfire scene, which was so aggressively juvenile that studio readers had flagged it as unbefitting of a serious satirical film. Brooks kept it. His argument, which he made repeatedly, was that the vulgarity was the point. The townsfolk in Blazing Saddles weren't sophisticated racists with carefully constructed ideologies. They were crude, petty, and small. The campfire scene wasn't a detour from the satire, it was the satire. Reducing them to their most embarrassing appetites was part of how the film stripped away the romantic mythology of the frontier. Not everyone at Warner Bros. Was fighting against the film. There was one significant exception, and his name almost never comes up in the popular history of Blazing Saddles. John Calley was the head of production at Warner Bros. During this period, and by most accounts, he was one of the few executives in the building who genuinely understood what Brooks was making. Calley had a reputation for backing difficult projects that other studios wouldn't touch. He had championed ambitious, uncommercial films before, and would again. In the case of Blazing Saddles, his role was less about advocacy and more about containment, keeping the more panicked voices in the building from gaining enough momentum to actually kill the project. Calley's support was never unconditional. He had his own notes and concerns, but he believed the film had cultural value, and more practically, he believed it could make money if it was allowed to be what it was. That second argument was the one that carried weight in the building. The artistic case for keeping the film's integrity intact was always going to be a harder sell inside a studio. The financial case, that watering down Blazing Saddles would make it indistinguishable from the dozens of mediocre westerns already crowding theaters, was harder to dismiss. The real reckoning came at the first major executive screening. This was the version of the film that Brooks had assembled, roughed in some places but largely representative of the final cut. The reaction in the room was, by multiple accounts, a study in discomfort. Some executives laughed, others went silent. A small number reportedly left before the film ended. What followed was a period of intense internal debate at the studio, with memos circulating about the film's commercial viability, its potential to generate protests, and whether Warner Bros. Really wanted its name attached to a comedy that spent 2 hours making audiences confront the ugliest assumptions baked into American mythology. The idea of shelving the film was not hypothetical, it was seriously discussed. There were people at the studio who believed the safest course of action was to take the loss on the production budget and quietly let the film die. The specific details of what was offered and to whom are difficult to verify with precision at this distance. The internal paperwork of that era isn't fully public, but multiple accounts from people involved in the production suggest that at least one conversation took place about buying the film back or renegotiating its release terms in a way that might have killed its theatrical run. Brooks held, and crucially, so did Calley's faction within the studio. The argument that ultimately won wasn't about art, it was about the test screenings. Because here is where Blazing Saddles did something that no studio memo could have predicted. It played. Not just well, it played explosively. When the film was shown to general audiences ahead of its 1974 release, the reactions were unlike anything the studio had seen attached to a comedy in years. People weren't just laughing, they were engaged in a way that felt different from passive entertainment. The film created a kind of shared experience in the room, a collective recognition of the absurdity it was skewering, and that recognition translated into exactly the kind of word-of-mouth energy that studios spend enormous amounts of money trying to manufacture and almost never achieve organically. The test screenings did something else too. They demonstrated that the film's most dangerous elements, the slurs, the satire, the fourth wall collapse at the end, were not problems for audiences. They were precisely what audiences responded to. People weren't walking out, they were telling their friends. The studio's worst fears about protest and backlash were not materializing in those early screenings in the way the memos had suggested they might. What was materializing instead was enthusiasm. This created a new problem for the executives who had been pushing to neutralize the film. The data didn't support their position anymore, and in a business where data carries more authority than artistic principle, that shift in the numbers changed the conversation. The film was going to be released. The question now was how to market something that defied every existing category.
Warner Bros. Had no real framework for Blazing Saddles. It wasn't a straightforward comedy. It wasn't a western. It wasn't a race film in the tradition that studios understood. It was all three and something else entirely, a film that used genre conventions as a delivery mechanism for social critique. The marketing team was left trying to sell a product they could only partially describe. Early promotional materials leaned heavily on the slapstick elements and played down the film's sharper edges, which was itself a kind of irony, using the same instinct to soften and sanitize that Brooks had spent the entire production fighting against. When Blazing Saddles opened on February 7, 1974, nobody at Warner Bros. Was fully prepared for what happened. The film landed with a force that surprised even its creators. Critics were divided. Some recognized it immediately as a landmark, others were disoriented by its form and unsure how to categorize it. But audiences made the question irrelevant. The film became a runaway commercial success, eventually earning over $119 million against a production budget of approximately $2.6 million. By any metric, it was one of the most profitable films the studio released that year. The box office numbers did more than validate the film. They changed what studios were willing to greenlight for the rest of the decade. Before Blazing Saddles, the industry's conventional wisdom held that comedies dealing with race in explicit terms were commercial risks too large to absorb. The film's success dismantled that assumption. It demonstrated, with the clarity that only revenue figures can provide in Hollywood, that audiences were not only willing to engage with uncomfortable material, they were hungry for it. They had been waiting for a film that reflected the social turbulence of their moment back at them without flinching, and Blazing Saddles was that film. The ripple effects were real and lasting. The success of Blazing Saddles contributed to a climate in which studios began taking more risks on comedies with sharp political edges, films that treated their audiences as participants rather than consumers. It didn't create that trend single-handedly, but it accelerated it. The conversation in development meetings shifted. The argument that dangerous material was always a financial liability had been proven wrong by the most unambiguous kind of evidence: